At the end of December 2011, Mr. Paul went to look at his allotments. The bird feeders had moved, but on closer inspection, although they had been told to remove them, they were still on the allotments. Mr. Paul also noted that some of the daffodils had been ploughed into. A letter was prepared and sent to the parish council, informing them that the bird feeders were still on the allotments, and that his daffodils had been ploughed into. The letter was agendaed for the council meeting of the 16th of January. Mr. Paul was to attend the meeting. In the open forum, a lady from the Women's Institute was to ask a question. Could the Women's Institute take part in the lighting of the beacon? The chair, Councillor Rita Rudkin, was to reply that the council had actually received a letter from the secretary of the Women's Institute, and it was going to be discussed on the agenda. The lady was to reply that she was the secretary. Then Mr. Paul wished to speak, and Councillor Rudkin asked him, "Are you a parishioner?" Mr. Paul replied, "What do you mean by that?" "Well, do you live in the parish?" Mr. Paul replied, "Yes." Then Councillor Rudkin said, "Well, tell us where you live then." Mr. Paul then said, "I'm not telling you where I live in a public meeting. Anyway, it says open forum. It doesn't say parishioners only." Mr. Paul was then permitted to ask his question. In the November minutes, it stated, regarding sending a letter to Mr. Ebbage, that the Crown and their agents to be written to, the police also to be informed. How was the police informed? The clerk was to reply that they had received a letter, like the Crown and the Crown's agents. When asked if there had been a reply from the police, the clerk said that the police had not replied, neither had the Crown or their agents. At the end of the open forum, Mr. Paul left the meeting. His letter was agendaed, and he didn't feel it was right to stay in the meeting and expect councillors to debate it while he was watching them. But Mr. Paul was informed the next day that when Councillor Rita Rudkin got to item 9b, Mr. Paul's letter, she stated that this has been covered in the open forum and passed straight over it. But the fact that Mr. Paul had written and stated that he had not given permission for Mr. Ebbage to be on the allotments was not covered in the open forum. So it seemed that Councillor Rudkin was quite happy for Mr. Bower to come into the parish council office and deceive councillors, but what is said in the open forum is not minuted and put into the parish council minutes. That meant that anybody who went to Holbeach Library and looked into the Holbeach Parish Council Minutes box and decided to read the minutes would see in November, under Crown Field Allotments, that Mr. Buxton had been to the parish council and complained about shooting, and a person had been written to. In December, that Mr. Ebbage's representative had stated that Paul Poll had given permission for him to be on the allotments, and in January, no mention that Mr. Poll has not given permission. The minutes are signed as a true and accurate record of the meeting. Anyone reading the minutes in the future could easily assume that the problem on the Crown Field Bank allotments and the shoot was all Mr. Poll's, because he had gave permission. At the parish council meeting of the 13th of February, Councillor Mayer was to report under allotments that there was no problems with the allotments, but the bird feeders were still on the Crown Field Bank allotment. Was Councillor Mayer in collusion with the shoot? And when Mr. Baird went into the parish council office and said Mr. Paul had gave permission for the shoots, was he aware that this would not be challenged? Because when it was reported to council, conveniently, Councillor Mayer was not at the meeting. Mr. Paul usually viewed the parish council minutes at the library. After the February meeting, when the January minutes were signed, Mr. Paul was to ask the clerk for a copy of the January minutes and a copy of the December minutes, which the clerk duly provided. This resulted in a third set of minutes for the December meeting. Firstly, there was the draft set that stated that Mr. Pole had quit his allotment in October 2011, which was subsequently sent out to councillors prior to the January meeting. This appears to have been printed out from an email sent in December. Then there was the set at the library, which had added into them, in the clerk's handwriting, that Mr. Pole had been served notice to quit his allotments in October 2012. The set provided by the clerk had the amendment initialed RR. Also, under the A17, there was also a change. The December minutes were to state that the chair was to meet with the clerk. So at the meeting, did the clerk amend the minutes so that they recorded the truthful fact, not what was actually said in the meeting, as the minutes that were amended appear to have been a raw copy as received via email, and as there is one copy with amendment to the A17 and initialed RR and another copy without it, this must have been done prior to the parish council meeting, because in the meeting there's no means of copying minutes, and if the clerk sat in the meeting and wrote in the amendment and then passed it to the chair to sign, there would not be a copy that was not initialed. So what was the actual truth as to what was said in the December council meeting? Was it that Mr. Pole had quit his allotment in October 2011? If he had quit the allotments, he'd have no right to complain about what was going on the allotments, and there'd be no further debate. Likewise, the chair would want to meet the clerk to discuss as to what they was going to do with the allotments, as to whether they was going to re-let them or hand them back to the Crown. And if Councillor Rudkin had given the date of October 2011 for quitting the allotments, intentionally or unintentionally, with the chair of allotments and the clerk neither present at the meeting, there was nobody to contradict her. Although Councillor Mayle was quite happy to write a letter regarding Mr. Pole's supposed intruding, there is no record of a letter being written regarding Mr. Bowd's intruding onto Mr. Pole's allotments. And although the council had been told about the bird feeders still being on the allotments, they still remained on the allotments. On the weekend of the 17th and 18th of March, someone went onto the allotments and replenished the bird feeders. Straw was spread onto the allotment, and also some straw put down some of the daffodil rows. So they was carrying on using the allotments to attract game. If Mr. Pole was to leave his allotments in October 12, how did they know that they could carry on using the allotment land for game cover to attract the birds? Had a deal already been done? Shoots can be very lucrative. Firstly, there is the charging of persons being on the shoot. Then, shot birds are also a saleable item. This is especially so when the tenant of the land is receiving nothing for the game that is taken from the land. While on the Crown Field allotments, Mr. Pole's daffodils grew with defiance, and it could easily be seen where the daffodils had been ploughed into and turned on by the Bowd Farming Company. His early white multi-head was ready for Mother's Day, while at Springfield's Gardens, in their daffodil plots, the Bridal Crown plot had no flowers showing, Bridal Crown being a later variety with up to 5 flowers on a stem, with the earlier, older variety only mustering 3. So was there a double interest when it was offered to Mr. Pole the chance to walk away from his allotments? The opportunity to cover up that Mr. Pole did not grow Bridal Crown? And who would have lifted and sold the bulbs that produced these lovely daffodil flowers?